our first session of the year 2021. So we're quite fresh and eager to engage in academic discussions. The seminar, the broader seminar, CSH seminar, aims at addressing contemporary and historical issues pertaining to South Asian societies, with focus on its economic, political, spatial, and social dynamics. We had already around 7-8 sessions last year, so we're continuing on our trajectory. And to give you a sense of upcoming sessions, we will have myself on 1st of February. We'll be presenting on political speeches in contemporary India, in particular speeches of prime ministers. And on 15th of February, Bruno Dorin will be presenting. And then we will have a session around every 15 days. But today we are welcoming Florian Bolazzi. Florian is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Sociology and Social Research at Milano Bicocca in Italy. She is a sociologist and economist who works on question of labor, has written her PhD on this, and she has also worked on a very prestigious database, which is the Palanpur database, who traces the historical transformations of a village in a small town in India. And today she will be discussing upward social mobility with regard to caste, in particular taking Palanpur, the example of Palanpur as case study. So she will use individual data for the entire population of Palanpur in Uttar Pradesh, and the data ranges from 1958 to 2015. She will be discussing whether caste at the Jati level plays a major role in determining social stratification in UP and in India at the larger level. So if it is fine with everyone, I will now open the floor and the mic to Florian, who will have around 45 minutes to present on this exciting topic, and then we'll open the floor to questions, and I'm sure that there will be many stimulating interaction after the presentation. So Florian, the mic is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I am very, very happy to present part of my PhD dissertation at the CSH, even if not in presence, unfortunately, because without the support of the CSH during my PhD, none of this work would have been possible, especially the support of Professor Himanshu, with whom I did my internship in 2014, and since then I have always worked on Palanpur, and especially in my thesis. So the presentation of today is not based on a paper, on an article, but on 2 chapters of my dissertation. So of course, I do not pretend to exhaustively cover all the contents of these 2 chapters, but if any one of you are interested in more details, I would be more than happy to share more. So my thesis was about the nexus between caste, class, and social mobility in the context of the last half-century structural transformations in India, and especially in rural economy. First of all, what is social mobility? Social mobility measures the movement between socioeconomic positions or classes in a given society during the life course of an individual or across generations. So, contrarily to studies of economic mobility based on income, in the sociological perspectives, occupation-based measures of social class capture a much more extensive range of the socioeconomic conditions which are considered to be determinant for future chances in life. And especially intergenerational mobility measures the effects of inherited advantages and disadvantages on the unequal access to opportunities. So just to give you an example about the difference between income, about using income to proxy a socioeconomic position and using occupation, I will share with you an example. Let's imagine a marginal farmer in a village who could possibly earn the same amount of money of a semi-skilled employee, for instance, a shop employee. However, in terms of impact, influence over the next generation's social class, there are important differences between these two social positions. While the former, the marginal farmer, would probably try to keep their sons from getting involved in education because of economies of scale. In the second case, we could imagine that the shop employee would be more prone to push their children into school. He would probably develop ties in cities or peri-urban areas, and this could make salient and crucial differences in the chances of children. And especially in the case of India, we argue that using social classes is more pertinent than using income, at least for two main reasons. Well, data on income are often biased because sensitive information, incomplete, for instance, they are mostly at the household level. They do not always grasp multi-activity, which has become the norm in rural economy, and they are not available, for instance, when it concerns surplus of agricultural farming and agricultural activities. And a second reason why it is very relevant to use social class in India is that historically there has been a strict association between caste and occupation, and so it is interesting to observe how this association weakened over time or not. Well, a major argument of the modernization theory, which has been the main theory applied to social mobility studies in Western societies, has been the increasing movement away from occupational inheritance and the transition from ascribed to achieved social position by the mediating effects of education and industrialization. Of course, there is a lot of debate. We know that in India, the industrialization, the modernization in a broad sense, has not been very similar to what has been observed in Western societies. However, we have a lot of expectations about social mobility increasing because with the structural transformations and the economic development of the last half century, well, we expect new opportunities, new occupations to open up to the population. And because these occupations are not historically linked to a specific caste, we expect caste do not act as a brake on social mobility as it was in the agrarian society. So conceptually, if the modernization theory would be tested in the Indian context, we would expect the influence of caste on class of destination, the social class of sons, let's say, to be weaker than the influence of caste on the class of origin in previous generations. The weakening of this link would have also an indirect effect on the link between the class of origin, the direct influence of the class of origin on the class of destination. And the weakening influence of caste is not the only factor, of course, that is expected to mediate the influence of origin on destinations, because we are in a situation where new occupations arise, spatial mobility increases with the better connectivity to cities, education has been expanding. So all these factors are expected to mediate the influence of the class of origin on the class of destination, or the hereditary effect. So in this conceptual framework, it is absolutely necessary to keep in mind the distinction, the conceptual distinction between caste and class, especially caste at the most disaggregated level, which is Jati. It is essential actually to distinguish as much as possible these two concepts in order to disentangle the influence of each of them on the social destination. So while caste or Jati is self-perceived and self-located, while class is a theoretical construction, I will say more about this later. Caste is ascribed and inherited by birth, while class of destination is achieved. Caste is linked with hereditary occupations, purity and rituals norms, and it delineates a rigid social order, while class it does not have necessarily a hierarchical dimension, except for notions of prestige or attainment score. Caste is invariant in composition at the Jati level and order, while order and composition of class is highly influenced by the structural transformations. And more importantly, individual intercaste mobility is impossible. I'm not saying collective mobility, because there has been cases of sanskritization very well documented in the literature, but individual intercaste mobility is impossible, because even in case of intercaste marriages, well, the caste of origins remains the same, while individual interclass mobility is possible. Very briefly, you know very well the context of the last half century structural transformations in India, but while there is evidence of economic development and decades of affirmative actions to reduce the disadvantage of historically discriminated groups, have somehow, for sure, some contributed to the massive decrease of poverty and the emergence of large middle class. On the other hand, there is also evidence of inequalities dramatically increasing, religious cleavages also deepening, and this is also true in the rural area. So, concerning social mobility, in the literature, we can find two contrasting narratives. On the one hand, there is evidence of the effects of caste weakening and the economic development to create new opportunities for social mobility for all groups of individuals. But at the other hand, we also find arguments for the stickiness of caste over time. According to these arguments, the caste hierarchy would continue to matter as a factor of social stratification, even if it has been evolving and reconfiguring, but caste remains an important predictor of economic opportunity. However, there are at least three important limitations in the intergenerational mobility studies in India, which is a quite recent field of investigation, contrary to Western societies where intergenerational mobility has been one of the most important workhorses of the social stratification studies. But in India, there are three limitations. First of all, the lack of longitudinal data. So generally, cross-sectional data are used instead, but they are not really they are not the ideal solution to study intergenerational mobility, because very often information on fathers' occupations are retrospective and can also be reported by the individual who is interviewed at the moment of the survey. And according to my experience, but not only my experience, also a lot of evidence in the literature, this could lead to biased information. First of all, because retrospective information necessarily is not very precise, and especially in a context where the regularity of employment is not the norm and pluriactivity is very common, and also because, for instance, in Palanpur, when I interviewed, I will introduce Palanpur in a few slides, but you all know about Palanpur. So when I interviewed individuals, you can be sure that in half of the cases, when I asked what is your main occupation, they answer, I'm a kisan, I'm a farmer. But then when you investigate furthermore, you realize that cultivation is only a complementary occupation, because most of the time is used to do other occupations. So these are the kind of biases that can be found in retrospective and reported information. And finally, which is probably one of the most important limitations, at the national level, it is impossible to disaggregate the administrative categories of caste into jatis, which are the proper birth-ascribed endogamous groups. And this is a problem because, well, the administrative categories, by definition, they assume a certain degree of socioeconomic homogeneity across jatis of the same category. This is why they are targeted by affirmative actions. So when we try to study the influence that caste has on class, you understand that the two definitions overlap, and by construction. So we need to really use the most disaggregated level of information on caste to disentangle the effect of caste on class. Fortunately, in Palanpur, we have some advantages. So first of all, the whole population has been surveyed 7 times from 1958 to 2015, which is a quite long period of time. And moreover, it is a period that has been characterized by very important transformations: the land reforms in the 50s, the Green Revolution, and later on the economic neoliberal reforms. But second, the second advantage in Palanpur is that we have information at the jati level. So in Palanpur, there are 8 or 9 jatis according to the period, and even few more, but they are residuals. But in this analysis that I will present, I will focus only on 4 of them. So for 2 reasons: for a question of numerosity, and for a question of representativity of the caste system, the caste hierarchy in UP. So first of all, Thakur, according to the definition, they were the dominant jati in the village. They are traditionally warriors, rulers, landlords. They have been large land owners, and they traditionally avoid to work themselves in cultivation. Then Moria, who are registered as other backward classes, they are traditionally self-cultivators. Teli, which is the largest Muslim caste in Palanpur, are traditionally oil pressers, but they have always been involved in agriculture as laborers. They own very little land compared to others, at least in the past. And finally, Jatav, who are registered as scheduled caste, they were traditionally untouchable. They have always been the most deprived caste in the village. And if we look at this map, they are quite segregated at the spatial level. So these are the households in Palanpur, which I have geolocalized in 2018. in the village. So you can see these troughs, little troughs, blue. They are the jatis families. They are quite concentrated around the ponds, which is considered the most insalubrious area. So, and also in terms of housing conditions, well, although previous studies documented the progress that has been made, still it is very visible that the housing conditions are poorer than in other areas of the village. Now, very quickly about the context, because the survey period is quite long and many changes happened in this period. First of all, the population has been considerably expanding from 500 individuals to almost 1,600 in 2015. And at the same time, the cultivable land per household has been considerably decreasing. So with the agrarian crisis and the pressure over land, marginal really exposed into a trade-off between leasing out the little land and migrating out in search of some regular employment, or staying in Palanpur and alternate part-time cultivation to casual manual works in nearby towns. In fact, in the last decade, the construction sectors and related services have been expanding and absorbing a lot of labor force exiting agriculture. So the choice between these two solutions, regular employment, for instance, in factories far away, or pluriactivity, is not an easy one to make, because land is hardly enough to suffice as a source of livelihood, and self-cultivation is mostly aimed to ensure the food security of the household. But leasing out the land on contracts or doing sharecropping means losing the food security for periods of labor shortage. And hiring laborers while working outside, for instance, has a cost that not many can afford in the village. And finally, land has always been not only an economic resource, but also a social marker. And being landless means losing the status for dominant jati, for instance. So then the majority prefer to commute and perform casual labor rather than migrating out. In this context, we are interested in understanding if the society became more fluid, in the sense that new opportunities open up to the individuals, but we are interested in exploring who accessed these opportunities more than others and why. And in particular, we want to analyze the Jati-class association, and we want to understand if this association has weakened over time. We apply an integrative mixed method approach. We use surveys data on the whole population. We have a lot of detailed information on social demographics, occupations, both at the individual and household level, that have been fully harmonized in a panel. Then we did a genealogical survey in 2018 in Palanpur to fill survey discrepancies and missing information, and to link all the households in order to do a longitudinal analysis. We also did a 6-month fieldwork in total from 2015 to 2018, and we carried out 102 semi-structured interviews in Palanpur, but also among migrants in Himachal Pradesh, Haryana, and Punjab. So for the analysis of the intergenerational mobility, we first need to define a relevant class schema. Theoretically, we engage with the life chances approach and consider different social classes as defined by groups of individuals who share a similar market situation, which determines the level of income, property, economic security, chances of economic advancement associated to a certain occupation or groups of occupations. But they also share the same work situation, which is the degree of authority and control that one has over the resources and production, and the nature of the employment relations. We use two criteria, conceptual criteria, to define class boundaries. Homogeneity, which implies that within a group of occupations, there are almost no barriers of movement. And structure, which refers to the pattern and strength of the barriers the barriers of movement. For instance, in the land size, moving from middle to large farmer positions implies to have more land, or it could also be skill levels. We select the primary occupations of individuals in terms of duration, so the occupations that have been performed the most in terms of days during the year. And we triangulate the survey data on occupations with very detailed interviews and observations that we have made with workers, but also with recruiters and intermediaries. And also we we're taking up the vernacular occupations used by the interviewees to describe differences between groups of occupations according to different degree of prestige. We define a 7-class schema which has a certain degree of correspondence with the EGP class schema, which is the standard schema used in social mobility studies in Western societies. But of course, we had to adapt this schema to the local context. For instance, the blue collars in Western societies are not considered in the same way in this schema. Here you can see this class, low salariat. So they are also a factory that in the EGP schema would be considered as blue collar at the lowest of the schema. Here, at the lowest the schema, we have casual manual workers, because being workers provides more security, provides also more chances of economic advancement than being a worker. So the class schema is composed, as you can see, large farmers, high salariat, middle farmers, low salariat, self-employed, agricultural laborers, and manual workers. Because we are interested in distinguishing horizontal mobility, which is the mobility between different sectors of activities, that is farm to non-farm, but also we are interested in vertical mobility, which is downward and upward. We need to give also a hierarchical dimension to this class schema. So we use in the analysis a collapsed version of this schema, which is top class, including large farmers and high salariat, middle class, which is middle farmers, low salariat, and self-employed, and low class, which includes agricultural laborers and manual workers. In order to define this hierarchical schema, we considered the vernacular categories because they tell about the reputation and the prestige associated to different jobs. For instance, the first distinction is between nokri and majduri. Nokri literally means employment and corresponds to wage regular job, mainly with a formal contract and in the service sector. While majduri literally means laborer and always corresponds to manual unskilled jobs, generally got at the labor mandi, and always without any contract. So majduri are always casual daily laborers. And it is also used in contrast with being a farmer, a kisan. A pakakam literally means certain definitive work, and it implies a certain regularity in time, irrespective of the nature of the contract. For instance, pakakam denotes the fact of getting a tika, a contract with money advance. And this is something that differentiates a contractor or a self-employed from a mazdur, a casual laborer, within the same sector of activity. Another important distinction is between dimag kakam, cognitive non-manual jobs, always involving education or technology. They are sometimes also defined as computer kakam, while at the contrary, mehnat kam means manual, hazardous job, generally entailing health issues. Finally, the distinction between the ganda kam and safai kam hide also some prejudices in terms of purity, which are associated with some occupations, especially because of caste segregation in some occupations. Because gandakam means dirty work and corresponds there, it is commonly used to denote break-in workers who are also from the lowest caste, while safaikam means clean work. Now, the analytical strategy. First of all, we measure intergenerational absolute mobility over time. Absolute mobility is the total movement between the classes of origins and the classes of destinations, which is different from relative mobility. Relative mobility measures the relative chances of being in a class of destination rather than another according to the class of origin. So an increase in absolute mobility does not necessarily imply a real weakening of the association between origins and destinations. And the relative mobility is more relevant to determine the influence that the social origin has on the relative chances of individuals to access different opportunities. Then we look at the factors and processes mediating the direct influence of origins on destinations, and in particular, jati. So to measure the absolute mobility, we use absolute mobility rates calculated from the mobility tables. To measure the relative mobility, we test different hypotheses with log linear models. And we also use generalized odds ratio, which is a standard measure of relative mobility. Then we analyze the interviews to highlight some factors and processes which explain trajectories of social mobility. And we do the same to analyze the Jati-class association over time, but we also use indexes of segregation and odds ratio, and finally, multi-logistic regressions estimating the influence of the Jati interacted with the class of origin. The data, I will go a bit faster because otherwise I will not have enough time to present the results, but we could match the 552 fathers class with sons class. We always use the first occupation surveyed, and we divide the pairs of sons and fathers that we matched in 3 cohorts of birth. The first cohort corresponds to fathers who born before 1955. The second cohort corresponds to fathers who born between 55 and 75, and then after 75. What is important here to say is that we have a relatively small quantity of missing pairs matched. So when I say sample, well, it is not a sample, in fact, because it's the whole population with, of course, some attrition due to migration and to death that we keep in mind in the analysis, but it's not a sample, and this is one of the advantages of this analysis. Well, now these are mobility tables, which are the standard tool in intergenerational mobility. In the rows, we have the class of origin. Here we have class of origin, the class of fathers, while here in the columns we class of destinations. We calculate the outflow. Oops, I think someone is writing. I can see lots of yellow. Okay, don't know what happened. Okay, the outflow rates tell us about the social class destination of individuals coming from different origins. So in other words, it's an indicator of the likelihood of people have different social origins of moving to various class destinations. If we look here, this is the first cohort. At the diagonal cells, we can see whether social immobility, sons of larger farmers being large farmers, has decreased or increased over time. So in the first cohort, we can observe two important things. First of all, the table is very sparse in the sense that there are a lot of structural zeros due to the fact that the occupational structure was much more simpler during the agrarian society, and classes were mainly agrarian, large farmers, middle farmers, agricultural laborers, and well, self-employed who were judgments mostly. And second, we can see that immobility largely prevailed among sons of the first cohort, while here immobility has decreased. For instance, large farmers in the first cohort were 73% were immobile, while in the second cohort they are 34%. And in the third cohort, only 15% of large farmers remain in the same class. So from the second cohort onwards, the outflows from large farmers to other classes increased considerably because almost 35% of farmers' sons maintained the same class in the second cohort, but also moved to middle farmers, which denotes a downward mobility. And similarly, we can see that from other agrarian classes too, there is a trend of downward mobility. While in the third cohort, we can see here that the class of manual workers, which was not existent before, is one of the class absorbing the majority of individuals moving out from agrarian classes, except large farmers, which is one of the top class. To sum up, absolute mobility has mostly been downward from the top class to the middle and low classes, reflecting the lack of opportunities for upward mobility in rural areas. However, as I said before, absolute mobility does not tell us much about the strength of association between origins and destinations. In fact, if we look at the changes in the occupational structure here, we can see that in orange, the class of large farmers considerably decreased, but at the top of the class schema, and contrarily to what happened in the Western society, the class of high salariates, here in pink, has not really expanded. So, which implies structurally a downward trend toward other classes. And in fact, we can see that manual workers class has expanded considerably, and less importantly, but still self-employed also has increased. To measure the association between class of origin and class of destination, net of the structural changes, we fit different hypotheses of independence between origins, destinations, and cohorts. I'm not sure I'll have enough time to go into detail, but here what is interesting to understand is that, for instance, in the first model, we test an hypothesis of total independence between the class of origins, the class of destinations, and the periods effect, the cohort. Yes? I don't know. Someone is
No, don't
talking?
worry, don't worry. It's
Okay. And then we test different hypotheses. For instance, in the second model called the conditional independence model, we test, we posit that origins and destinations are independent within each cohort, and only the structural changes make a difference. In a third model, we postulate an association between origins and destinations, which would remain stable over time. And finally, in the last two models, we test different hypotheses on immobilities because we fit the diagonal cells. Well, if you have questions later, we can discuss more. But what is interesting here is that by testing different hypotheses, we obtain some more consistent information about the patterns of associations between the social class of destination and the social class of origins. In fact, the only two models that explain better the observed trends in the mobility tables are the last two. What does this mean? It means that here in model 4, it means that immobility has decreased for all at the same. So can you see that someone is writing on my screen? This or not? It's very strange. I see a lot of yellow and blue lines. Someone is writing. I don't know how this is possible, but okay, I will go on. So here we can see from this analysis, we can conclude that immobility has decreased for all, but not at the same pace. So it means that for some classes, immobility has considerably decreased, but some other classes have maintained an advantage in terms of immobility. I will just summarize the results because I don't have enough time. Social fluidity or relative mobility has increased for all classes over time, net of the structural changes. However, the hereditary effect is more persistent among top class. Sons of large farmers and high salariat are more likely to be in top class than others. Farmers lost their advantage for immobility after the Green Revolution and became more likely to become large farmers than previously, but also to move downwardly into agricultural labor. Finally, there is a strong disadvantage of manual workers and agricultural laborers of experiencing upward mobility compared to others. If you agree, I will use 5 to 10 minutes to present the part on caste, because otherwise it would be very regrettable. So until now, we have described the trends and patterns of association between origins and destinations, but ignoring the fact that the direct influence of the social class can be reinforced or weakened by other factors, for instance, Jati. So from the interviews, we found that the occupational preferences of dominant Jati are still influenced by ritual norms to protect their status from negative stigma. And the ritual status is reproduced in particular in the distinction between salaried employment, which is considered prestigious, and casual manual work, which is considered humiliating. So here you can see some selected parts of the interviews. Lakshmi Moria, 35 years old, says, "I have never seen my field, even if my household or my son is dying of thirst. This is a question of honor. I will not bring the water. I cannot dishonor my community." So you can see the sense of preventing from being dishonored by keeping the rituals alive. And this is the case of a woman who says that she will never go out because it is bad considered by the community. And here Ramesh says tacos turn out of their ideas, not their body. Tacos are the top caste. We have a computer in our minds. We compute and calculate things. However, there is an emerging opposition between ritual and economic status among the community at the cost of pauperization, even of the top caste groups. For instance, here we can see Manish, who says there are many unemployed people in the village, but work in bricking, which is considered a very dirty job, is dependent on the jati. Moria and Thakur do not work in Bata. Jatav work in it. People choose a profession according to their, see, the 5 fingers of the hand are not equal. And Chaman Kumar says, the reason is that Thakurs get less wage, and Thakurs can't work in activities of the kind that inferior jati can do. Consequently, the means of livelihood available to Thakurs are less. You can see I was talking about the cost of pauperization. The need to sustain the honor, hijat, should not be compromised by the economic needs. So what I noticed in the analysis of the interviews is that there is a common perception of declassment of the dominant jati, the Thakurs, and a perception of empowerment of the lower jati. Here you can see Nani, who is a Teli, a Muslim from a scheduled caste, who says these Thakurs smell bad because they don't even take bath every day. Their clothes are not clean, and yet they call themselves Thakur. In order to wear the clothes, you need money, and for money, you need to work. Bablu Jatav 24 says, we Jatavs have always been Mazduri, manual workers, but now we are not dependent on them, Thakurs, anymore. I am still poor, but I work hard, and I will the future of my children. So there is this idea of power shifting from the ritual sphere, which is still considered important, but only by a dominant caste, from the economic sphere, where a lower jati perceive an opportunity to empower themselves. Suni says, the thing is that Thakurs don't want to take up inferior occupations, jobs of badnami, shame, because it defames their status, therefore they call it chota kam. But also here it is interesting because he says superior jati are lagging behind. This is the effect. If the inferior jati earn more than what superior jati earn, so then this is why inferior jati are moving forward at a greater pace. But when looking at the data now to compare what emerged from the interviews, we found, I will go very quickly, but we found a decrease of the jati segregation by the class segregation by jati. Here you can see an index of segregation, which is called multigroup index of dissimilarity, and displays the level of class segregation by jati. The higher is this index, and the stronger is the concentration of certain jatis into single occupations. So here you can see that the segregation has slightly decreased over time, but not for all. In fact, here in yellow you can see the Jatavs. Well, in their cases, the segregation has increased. They have become more and more segregated into manual workers' occupations, which could provide some empowerment in terms of economic advancement and resources, but still they are at the bottom of the class hierarchy. And while in the case of Teli, the Muslim scheduled caste, well, there has been a strong decrease until 1975, but then an increase again. overall, you can see that the class caste association somehow we can say has globally decreased. So this is my last finding. In order to estimate the influence of the jati on the probability of an individual to be in the top, medium, class, taking in account all the other factors that could mediate the effect of the class of origin, here class of the father, on the class of destinations, we control for many factors, many individual factors such as marital status, household size, the birth ranking of the sons, because we found evidence of eldest son not having the same chances of being in a certain occupation than other sons for some rationales at the household levels. And we also control for the household size, the court of birth in order to control for the period effects, and we control for the interaction of the jati and the class of origin, because we want to know how the jati affects the probability of an individual to be in a class, but also accordingly to the class of origin. And what we obtain here, so you can see these are the average marginal effects of the jati per class of origin on the class of destination. So let's take, for example, this corner here concerning Jatab. Here, the line, the green line with the triangles indicates the class of origins. And here we estimate the effect that the jati has, that being a jatav has, on the probability to be on the top class while having origins in the low class. And what we can see here is that for jatavs, well, the jati average marginal effect on the probabilities of being upwardly mobile from low class to top class decreased over time and narrowed down the difference of probabilities with the category of reference, which is a category where we pool the different jatis to obtain a quite heterogeneous group. So here, maybe it's very small, so you cannot see, but there is a quite huge difference, because in the first cohort, so sons of the first cohort, well, they had 64% less percentage points probability of being on the top class when having origins in the low class due to the jati effect, due to the fact of belonging to a lower caste. But in the third cohort, you can see that this disadvantage has considerably decreased. So this was one of the main, the most interesting results of this analysis. But unfortunately, it is not the same for teli, who are also at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, because in this case, jati has a persistent and a positive effect on the probability here to remain low class. So I think I should stop. I had also some interesting findings on other factors like education, networks effects, skills, but the time is over, so I will conclude. Social immobility has decreased overall, but opportunities for upward mobility are limited. The emerging trade-off between commuting for doing casual manual work and migrating out for low salariat leads to downward mobility of agrarian classes in Palanpur. And concerning the Jati-class association, we have found a general decrease of this association. The association has weakened over time. low ranking to manual workers and self-employed. But when we control for everything for the class of origins and other household and individual characteristics, we found that the Jati disadvantage on upward mobility decreased in the last cohort. But the idea of prestige associated to different social positions is still affected by residual ritual norms, as we saw from the interviews. However, with the shift of power from the ritual sphere to the economic sphere, the lower jatis feel empowered from the dominant jati. Finally, unfortunately, I had not enough time to talk about other factors and mechanisms that we analyzed in the regression, but also in the interviews, but we found strong evidence of bribes, unreliability of trains, poor public education, and absence of formal vocational training, acting like bonds to development and social mobility. Okay, thank you. I would be more than happy to hear from you some comments.
Thank you, Florian, for this truly interdisciplinary research and findings. So I will not, I'll not keep the floor long. I'm sure that there are many questions. So Bruno maybe is raising his hand, wants to go first.
Hi.
Hello, Florian, and thank you very much for this presentation. I'm really impressed from the last time we saw at CSH. You really clarified, your presentation is really good, and I think you can publish many papers from this. And I wanted to congratulate you. It's really interesting. And I have few questions because it was very clear. I took some, maybe it could be nice if you can send your PPT to digest, to take more time to digest. But congratulations again. I just have a technical question. In one slide, the slide changes in the occupational structure 58 to 2015. I don't yet understand why we don't have a 100% share. Why it is decreasing? What means this decrease? How we can interpret this decrease? You know, between the agriculture. But
Bruno, we have lost you.
Could you just explain?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you properly. I missed a part of the question.
The end of it, if Bruno, you could rewind a bit and repeat what you said in the last 30 seconds.
Yes, I missed the question. Sorry, I couldn't hear you properly.
I think. Oh, okay.
I'm back again. I was disconnected. I just want to understand why there is a decrease, the overall decrease, and why it is not 100%. What are the blank means?
But here, you mean in this slide, right?
Yes, right.
Okay, no, I think it's my bad. Here in gray, this part is gray color. They are manual workers. Okay.
On the top. So on the top, it's gray
on the
color.
top. On the top. Yeah. No, I just show the missings. The missings. Okay.
Okay.
Yes, it is just. Yeah, there is a small percentage missing because I didn't have the information in 2009 for some individuals for whom I had the information before.
Okay.
If you have
right, are there other questions from the floor? If not, I am receiving questions in private, so I can read them out if you want. So, for instance, Aparajita has two questions for you. One, I'm reading what she wrote. How does rise in social location negotiate intergenerational poverty? Question mark. Point two, I know your study is not about this subject, but would like to say an increase in social mobility is linked to fertility decline. So here, one question and one comment. You would like maybe.
Okay, can you repeat please the first one, because
how does rise in social location negotiate negotiate intergenerational poverty? If Aparajita is here, she can also step in and precise.
Yeah. Hi, there's construction going on near me, so sorry, that's why I was sort of sending you the questions. Both of them are questions. The first one is about intergenerational poverty. How does the rise in one in the social location of one family, how does it impact poverty from the previous generation? And the second is about whether family size decreases or increases proportionate to social mobility or a rise in social location. Thanks.
Okay. May I answer?
Yeah, of course, of course.
Okay. Okay, I am not sure I understood the first questions about the social location. I don't understand what do you mean by social location, but I will answer the second question for now. So, of course, we studied also the demographic changes in the village during the surveyed period. In terms of fertility. What I can say based on my findings is that we found a link between social mobility to some extent and changes in the fertility rate, especially for large farmers' families. In fact, we found, well, we use a proxy to the fertility rate, which is the adult-child ratio among the households, and we found that large farmers' households are less likely to partition, in the sense that they are more likely to remain joint, to maintain a joint household model. And probably this is a strategy, an answer to face the risk of land fragmentation, which is one of the structural factors leading to downward mobility to middle farmers or out to agrarian classes. So in this case, we have observed that large farmers' households tend to decrease their fertility rate and to remain jointly in order to mechanically maintain a higher proportion of cultivable land available per head. But for the other classes, well, there has not been huge changes in terms of fertility rate, and neither in terms of partition. It's very marginal. So I don't think that it would have a huge influence of social mobility.
Thank you, Florian. I think that Nicola has a question and would like to step in to ask it, and maybe after we can move to the question of Sunanda Desai.
Yes, well, I have a couple of questions. It's a very nice presentation. Indeed, very clear. And yeah, so I have, but I mean, of course, since you presented a lot of things, there were some things. So I was first, yeah, wondering, I think it's very interesting to appraise the impact over time of the caste on the mobility, on the occupational mobility. But I was not sure about the method exactly that you use for that. Very often, at least in the literature, I know about that. When people measure mobility, very often they do a regression on the let's say in your case the occupation of the son, on the occupation of the father. Sorry for being sexist, or I mean the occupation of the daughter on the, but it's very often the son. And then you know, so you do a regression for that, you know, and the regression coefficient gives you the correlation, and this is usually you know, considered to be a good measure of mobility. And then you could you could cross this, and you could check whether this coefficient itself is affected by the caste of the father, and then you can really measure over time that. But I don't think you have done this. At least I haven't seen this, or my question is whether you have done it or not, or whether you intend to do it. It will be very interesting to see, you know, the impact of the caste of the father on this correlation coefficient of the occupation of the son over the father's occupation. So that's this, you know, I mean, a suggestion, or I don't know, perhaps a clarification question that I asked. And also, I wasn't sure in the methodology that you were referring to at some point, you were talking about the log, and you were doing the logarithm of the occupation. So I wasn't quite sure to understand what does it mean. Take the log of an occupation. Only provides you a hierarchy, a ranking. So it's just numbers which are ordered, but the ordering of these numbers doesn't make, you know, is not, you know, significant except to provide an order. And therefore, I was not sure to understand why you were taking the log of this. Sometimes we take the log of the income because, you know, it's a transformation of a cardinal variable, but taking the log of an occupation was not quite clear to me. But perhaps, you know, you could say a few things about that. And my last little comment was, you know, just I was a bit surprised in the table that you showed us, especially the first table on when you show the mobility, you know, the matrix, you know, origin destination matrix. That you know, over time there has been a lot of changes, which strike me as extremely severe, and I was surprised to see the severity of these changes. I don't know whether you could come back to this matrix here, if you have the ability to do so. Yes. I think that's the one here. Yes. So, for instance, if you take the first cohort in the self-employed line, you see that you have 50% of self-employed who were coming from a high salaria and 50% of SE. And then when you move to the next cohort, the numbers change radically. I mean, it's possible, but obviously it's quite surprising because very often this kind of a pattern of mobility tend to be stable, I mean, to some extent. Of course, they do change among cohort, but I was impressed by the severity of those changes. So perhaps you could comment on that. And I'm done. Thank you very much for this very nice presentation. Okay.
First of all, yes, I did regression. So I do not use attainment scores, which are sometimes used in the methods you mentioned, but I did regressions in the sense that I estimated the probability. I haven't shown this here, but I estimated the probability of individuals of being in each of the 7 different classes of destinations according to the of origins. So the independent variable was the class of origins, the class of the fathers. And I added controls like the caste, individual and household characteristics. And I, of course, obtained some results that goes in the same direction what I could observe from the mobility tables. So what I skipped very quickly in this presentation is the elaboration of these tables using a generalized odds ratio, which are very standard measures of relative mobility, in sense measures of the strength of association between origins and destinations in each of these cells, net of the margins change, which are very huge. You are right. So the results of my regression went in the same directions. But in general, in this study, I do prefer to concentrate on descriptive and all of measures than regressions, because I have a relative small size of the population. So the moment I try to add interaction terms to more precisely control the SE parameters, well, I use a statistical power, which tends to because I work on the whole population, and statistical significance is not so significant for interpretation. But still, why to do econometrics if I have the whole population and I can measure the strength of association of the measure? So this was my first answer. But yes, I can work more, and I will for the publication, so I could integrate also further analysis. Concerning the log linear, well, once again, sorry for this, but I wanted to present the maximum of things I did, so I haven't enough time to explain everything. Here, the logic is that we work on a data set where we report the frequencies of each, the frequencies of the mobility tables. So we want to report the frequencies that we observed in the mobility tables. And we think about the frequencies in each cell as being the result of three main effects: the effects of the origins, the effects of the and the period effect, which is the value of the cohort. And we try to test different specifications to understand which coefficients explain better the observed frequencies. So what we use is standard models. We use a generalized Poisson log linear regression, which is a standard tool for this analysis. So we start from a saturated model, which explains perfectly the observed frequencies, and then we remove some coefficients in order to understand what effects increase the goodness of fits of the model we use to describe patterns in the mobility tables. So yeah, it is a pity to describe it so quickly, but here what is interesting is that we can see that net of the structural changes, so the occupational structure that changes a lot and so mechanically influences the social mobility, we can see that there is a change in the strength of association between the origin and the destination, that is the direct influence of the origin of the destination, irrespective of the changes in the margins, that matters in explaining how the mobility tables have changed hugely. And indeed, they did. Well, here, what we see are percentages. So, of course, there is a huge part of margins effects. And the example of the self-employed you notice is interesting, because first cohort, so I look at the first cohort are sons of or so really just after the land reform, self-employment, sons of self-employed were very likely to be immobile. So judge money relations were still there. So the judge money's occupations are occupations that are inherited by birth and really are ruled by the caste systems, because they are mostly a landless group who provide services to landlords in exchange of cash crops. So I do have evidence from previous
Florian, you might want to try to switch off your video to maybe gain a little bit of internet traction, because your voice is really cut off quite often.
And is it better now?
Marginally, yes. Marginally.
Okay. Okay. So, but maybe I will time now to to take another question. But this is one of the reasons why self-employment trends really changed a lot.
Right. So Sonalde Desai wanted to ask a question, and then after that, maybe after Florian's answer to this, I will probably read out a few questions that have been asked in the chat box.
Florian, congratulations. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I particularly liked the way you classified various occupations. I had just one question and a small comment. The question is, do you include migrants in this study? Because some of the upper landlords might actually have their sons who are now living in city and working. And so there may be actually an upward mobility which is not captured through the current population living in Palanpur. The second issue was more of a comment, that if there is a consistent downward mobility for every occupational group, does the meaning of occupations change over time? Because I suppose in thinking of social hierarchies, we can't have everybody going down. There must be someone in which case some of the downward classes might be reclassified. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Very important questions. Of course, my downward mobility we observe here. Well, it is partly downwardly biased by migration. Because, as I said in the introduction, migration, commuting prevailed over migration, and migration remained relatively marginal in the sense of permanent migration. In 2015, there was 15 individuals, over 1,000 individuals migrated out, comparing with the previous. So you can understand it is not a huge proportion of the population that missed because of migration. But you are right. We observe the left behind. We observe those who remained in the village because of the ties to agriculture, because of migration is risky. There is a lot of nostalgia from the village and many reasons. Unfortunately, there has been lots of inverse migration. So households or individuals who came back to Palanpur after a period of migrations, and we could work separately on the occupational mobility of migrants in another in a separate chapters. But you are right. The ones who migrated totally permanently, it is because they found better opportunities outside. So this is an important bias in Palanpur. Now, concerning the fact that downward mobility has been the prevalent trend, even when we look at relative mobility, in the sense that we control for the margins effects. Well, I fear this is the reality. But the good news is that, of course, property, as Manchu and Lanju and previous researchers have shown in Palanpur, because incomes also from casual manual works are somehow better than incomes from agricultural labor. But in the sense, in the sociological perspective, in terms of life chances for future generations, well, it is not very positive to be a casual worker, because it does not provide better chances to the children for accessing better opportunities. In particular, I have no time to talk about education and other factors, but for instance, one of the problems, one of the barriers to the mobility from manual workers to self-employed, which could be at least mobility, is the absence of formal vocational training. So there is a lot of problem related to the informal training that manual workers could get from skilled artisans, because it entails a long period of apprenticeship, which is poorly paid and requires devotion and respect to their master, which could be humiliating also for superior jatis. And moreover, skilled artisans are reluctant to share their knowledge because they fear for future competitors. And plus, becoming a self-employed requires financial capacity, because in this informal context of getting contracts, recruiting leave advances, it requires to having the financial capacity to pay in advance the workers. So yes, I fear that despite, although my class scheme could partly maybe reinforce the downward mobility, it is also very much rooted in the reality, this trend that we observe. Yeah.
Thank you.
Imanshu wanted to ask a question. If somehow answers could be punchy and concise, because we have I think around 7-8 questions in the chat box, and
sure.
we ideally aim at finishing at 6:30, but we might take a couple more minutes, but to keep the framework in mind. Imanshu, would you like to unmute yourself? Imanshu?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. So a quick clarification to Nicola first, that the kind of an exercise that he's talking about is already there, and we've already done that kind of an exercise of the regression based on incomes, not on occupations, because that's where it is easier to do that kind of an exercise. And those intergenerational elasticities are there in the Palanpur book, and also the Great Gatsby curve is there. But I think on this presentation, which is a very fantastic work in that sense, and I think one has to accept that there are going to be problems of this kind of an exercise. Simply because occupations are, here what we are doing is that the researcher, any researcher would like to work on this kind of an exercise, would have to create these ordinal categories where you order the occupations. And these are not fixed, and therefore you might have a problem in terms of which one is giving, because sometimes a manual work, a casual work may give you more earning than, say, for example, agriculture, which also you pointed out. But it's also a problem, for example, the large farmers, when you define as somebody who is having 25 bighas and above. Now, over a period of 70 years, that strict definition of 25 bighas will be difficult to implement, simply because the population has gone up by 2.5 times. So average. So one way to do it would be, and this is a suggestion, to do it in terms of, say, the quintiles of average, the land holdings, or do something which is justifies. For example, 25 bighas now is too big. When 1950s, when the Babylonian population was very small, it really meant large farmers. Today, that would be completely different. The second, I think, is something which I wanted to pose a question, which I think you can try and think of in trying to publish papers, and more true for occupational diversification and mobility. You see, in the last 70 years, a number of new occupations have come up, which were not there in the 1950s. For example, in the 1950s, the village was primarily agricultural. So most of the occupations were related to agriculture. Like, say, for example, NREGA, or for example, the occupation that came with, say, self-employment mechanics, or for example, those who are doing other kind of self-employed work. Those were not there because that came because of economic progress. As economic progress happens and incomes increase, the range of activities will increase. But that may not necessarily be related to mobility. Or for example, do you mean that agricultural laborers in the 1960s or manual ag worker in 1990s, they're more or less the same. It's just the sector which has changed simply because the occupational profile of the village itself has changed. How do you account for that is something which is a challenge, and I think it's not something which is for you, but in general, this has been a challenge for people who are studying occupational mobility. Finally, one point which again is a critical issue, and I would like you to clarify in a sense to, I mean, I have read the work, that your paper or thesis also, but in general to clarify, see, when you have one father and 4 children, and obviously 4 of them are having, say, for example, coming to 4 different categories, then the upward and downward mobility can have a completely different kind of meaning because it's something which is a very ordinal kind of an exercise. So I would use a term upward and downward very carefully rather than say, for example, saying that there is greater mobility for Jatas on the people at the lower end of this caste spectrum compared to the Mauryas who are the agricultural caste, in terms of diversity of the number of occupations that they're moving in, rather than saying downward and upward very, very strictly. So I will just be careful in using those words. And I think that's some of the confusion is coming because of that. The rest of the question, I think you have already answered. So that is it.
Okay, so thank you very much for these suggestions, which I will surely take in account for publications. So concerning the quantiles of land holding, indeed, this is what I did. So I calculated the quantiles of land holding at each period, and I tried to find a compromise to define a class of large farmers which could make sense over the whole period. And this is, of course, imperfect, and this is also symptomatic of this kind of work and the problems related to the analysis of such a long period of time with so many transformations in the occupational structures, because not only for the definition of large and middle farmers, I had to face this kind of problems of finding a compromise that could make sense over the period, but also for the other classes. For instance, self-employment also has changed a lot. And of course, as you can see here in the first cohort, manual workers and high salariat were not there. So these are structural zeros, which I also take in account in commenting my results. But this is the best solution I could think about in the thesis. I will certainly think more. And in order to deal with these imperfections, what I did is to distinguish what I call horizontal mobility, exactly as you said, as the sons of an agricultural laborer. If he is a manual worker, I would consider it as horizontal mobility, that is immobility actually, because I consider that the life chances associated to being an agricultural laborer or manual workers are plus or less the same according to my definition. Similarly, for large farmers and high salariat, well, large farmers was a meaningful top class in the occupational structure in the agrarian society, while nowadays being high salariat means to be in the top class. So I tried as much as possible to define a hierarchical model by taking in account these changes due to the period effect. Yeah.
Fantastic. Let me read quickly the questions that were asked in the chat box. I'm bundling them together so that maybe we can have a concise answer from your side. Elsa is asking, does the dominance of large farmers hamper social mobility among other classes? Question mark. Ramesh Babu is asking, does demographic mobility from rural to urban, what are the new livelihood pattern among the lower class? I suppose there's a question mark at the end. Bhupendra Kumar, thank you. When we try to understand social mobility in terms of caste, as in closed class, according to B.R. Ambedkar, how can we understand the caste-based occupation, social mobility in terms of stigmatized labor as a vocation, and when it becomes profession, it becomes a dignified labor? Question mark. Manika is asking, there are specific jatis that are showing upward mobility as opposed to other. For instance, jatas are showing mobility and talis are not. Is there any understanding of how specific jatis have attained greater political cohesion and dominance corresponding to rise of certain political parties in the regional constituencies? And last but not least, Swati Sharma is asking, in your thesis, do you also discuss the mechanism that have led to weakening of caste class rigidity? Question mark. For instance, do you think affirmative action can explain the result regarding the differences in the trend observed for jatas benefiting from SC reservation, whereas Teli Muslims benefiting from OBC reservation, which benefits higher proportion of population? Question mark. Modernization has weakened the joint family system that breaks devotion to the custom ritual and shift up the aspiration? Question mark.
Okay, thank you very much for all these questions. It is very constructive, and it will help me also for my future work. Of course, I will not answer to all of them exhaustively. So concerning affirmative action, I think this is one of the weaknesses of my work, because I could not take in account, I could not measure the influence of affirmative actions directly in my analysis. But of course, we have a lot of details and information from previous works. So what I can say, first of all, is that the beneficiaries of affirmative actions have been relatively small, few, much fewer than what I expected. And not always they have been the ones who needed the more. For instance, the land redistribution not always went to landless households, but also to landed households. But for instance, we observe a pattern of mobility during the second cohort from agricultural laborers to middle farmers, and we know that this pattern is linked to this operation of land redistributions in 1976. So to some extent, yes, I do think that affirmative actions could have had an impact on some upward mobility, especially the land redistributions. Now, another question that I can take. So,
Florian, if you're fine with this, we can also
yes, no, I just want to yes. Right. There is a question.
Just dropping your email to the chat box in the chat box, so that people can maybe approach you personally to continue this discussion. If you maybe want to answer a last question before we proceed to that.
Yes, I will send my email and I will be very happy to keep in touch. I will just answer the questions asking about different mobility patterns according to caste. So here you can see the probability of being in a specific class rather than being in another classes with respect to the same probabilities of an average individual in the village. So you can see, for instance, the probability that Moria had in the first cohort, the second cohort, and the third cohort, the probability that they had to be large farmers compared to the others. So the analysis of this kind of odds ratios showed that Thakurs, who are the dominant caste, still have an advantage for the top class because they are more likely to be in the high salariat class, while Moria still have an advantage for farming, but especially as middle farmers and large farmers, and previous landless Jati concentrating the manual workers, because they had no land and they have no education. So this is a sum up of the kind of trends that differentiate the caste. So this was my last answers, but I would be super happy to keep in touch with those of you who have more questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Florian, for your time, your energy, and your detailed explanation about your fantastic research. We were very happy to have you here at CSH, and without more discussion, we're calling this presentation to an end, and we cordially invite everyone present here for our next presentation in 15 days. You will be emailed for that. So thank you so much once again, and let's meet again very soon.
Thank you. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye. Bye.
Bye.